I never thought I'd be the kind of daughter who counted what she gave, because for most of my life, giving felt like breathing. It was just what I did. I was the reliable one, the one who showed up early and stayed late, the one who answered the phone on the first ring and never let it go to voicemail. In our family, I was the middle child, sandwiched between a brother who moved away young and a younger sister who was always fragile, according to my parents, delicate, in need of protection. I learned early that love in our house didn't always come in equal portions, and if you wanted to be seen, you had to be useful. My parents were good people in the ways that count on paper. They paid their bills, went to church on Sundays, donated canned goods at Thanksgiving. But inside the home, there was a quiet hierarchy. My sister, Leela, sat at the top, not because she demanded it, but because my parents built the pedestal themselves. She had asthma as a child, then anxiety as a teen, then a string of jobs she quit because the stress was too much. Every stumble became a reason for my parents to hover closer, to excuse more, to expect less. I was the opposite, healthy, capable, the one who didn't need checking on. So they didn't. When I moved back home in my late 20s, it wasn't because I failed. It was because my father had his first stroke. My mother called me late one night, her voice small, and asked if I could come for a little while. A little while turned into years. I took a job nearby, moved into my old bedroom, and slowly became the glue holding everything together. I drove them to appointments, managed medications, cooked meals, cleaned the house, handled insurance calls that left my mother in tears. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself family does this for each other. I told myself I didn't need thanks. Leela lived 20 minutes away then, close enough to visit, far enough to avoid responsibility. She came by on holidays, sometimes brought flowers, always left early. When I asked for help, she'd sigh and say she was overwhelmed, that she couldn't handle seeing Dad like that Mom stressed her out. My parents nodded, sympathetic. They never asked her to push through it. They asked me to understand. Understanding became my full-time job. As the years passed, my father's health declined. My mother's knees gave out. I paid for a ramp to be installed. I dipped into my savings for a new washer when theirs broke. I stopped dating because it was easier than explaining why I couldn't stay out late or take weekend trips. I watched my life shrink to the size of their needs and told myself it was honorable, that one day when things settled, I'd have time again. I didn't realize time doesn't wait for permission. The first crack came quietly, like most betrayals do. I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen one evening when they thought I was asleep. My name floated through the hallway, followed by words like dependable and strong. Then my sister's name, followed by worried sighs. My mother said something about wanting to make sure Leela was taken care of. My father agreed, his voice tired but firm. I stood there in the dark, holding my breath, telling myself not to jump to conclusions. Parents worry, parents plan. It didn't have to mean anything. I let it go. That was my mistake. A year later, my father passed away. The house felt hollow without his presence, and grief settled into my bones like damp cold. I handled the funeral arrangements, the paperwork, the condolences. Leela cried loudly at the service, clung to my mother, told everyone she didn't know how she'd survive this loss. People patted her back and told her she was brave. I stood off to the side, collecting coats, handing out programs, swallowing my own grief because there were things to be done. After the funeral, my mother changed. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. She became sharper with me, quicker to criticize, less grateful for the help I continued to give. When I suggested hiring part-time care so I could cut back my hours at work, she frowned and said, "We don't need strangers, we have you." When I mentioned feeling tired, she reminded how much Leela was struggling with her anxiety. I learned that even my exhaustion had to wait its turn. The day I found out about the will wasn't dramatic either. No thunderclap, no shouting, just a manila folder on the kitchen table and my mother asking me to sit down. She looked nervous, which was unusual for her, and for a brief, foolish moment I thought she was about to thank me, maybe even reassure me. Instead, she cleared her throat and said she wanted to be transparent. She explained that after my father died, they'd finalize their estate plans, the house, the savings, everything. She said it slowly, carefully, like breaking bad news to a child, and then she said Leela would inherit the house and the majority of the assets. My ears rang. I waited for the rest, the part where she explained my share. It didn't come. I asked very calmly if there was something missing. My mother frowned, as if confused by the question. She said they assumed I'd be fine, that I was independent, that Leela needed security. She said, "You understand, don't you?" in the same tone she used when I was 10 and told to give my sister the bigger slice of cake. I nodded, not because I understood, but because something inside me went very still. Years of appointments and meals and sacrifices lined up in my mind like unpaid invoices. I thought of the nights I slept with one ear open, listening for my father's breathing, the promotions I turned down, the life I put on hold. And in that moment, I realized none of it had been seen as a gift. It was an expectation. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I just said I needed some air and went for a walk. I walked for hours until my feet hurt and my thoughts slowed enough to make sense. I wasn't angry in the way people expect. I was empty. And in that emptiness, a question formed that I'd never allowed myself to ask before. What would happen if I stopped? The answer terrified me because stopping meant changing who I was. It meant letting go of the role that had defined me for decades. It meant risking being called ungrateful, selfish, cruel. But it also meant reclaiming something I'd lost without noticing, myself. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to my mother move around the house. I knew if I got up, I'd fall back into routine, make tea, check locks, set alarms. I knew how easy it would be to pretend the conversation never happened, but I also knew something had shifted and there was no unfeeling it. The next morning, I made a decision. I didn't announce it. I didn't make demands. I simply began to step back. I stopped volunteering for every task. I said no to a few appointments. I suggested Leela come by more often. Each small boundary felt like a rebellion, and with each one, the house grew colder. My mother noticed immediately. She asked if I was sick, if something was wrong. I told her I was tired. She reminded we're all tired. Leela didn't notice at all, at least not at first. She was used to things being done before she arrived, used to comfort appearing on cue. But when it didn't, when the fridge wasn't stocked and the paperwork piled up, the phone calls began. That's when I learned how quickly love can turn into accusation. The first accusation came disguised as concern. My mother called me mid-morning, her voice tight, asking if everything was all right at work because she'd noticed I'd been forgetting things. I knew what she meant. The prescription refill I hadn't picked up, the grocery list still sitting on the counter. I told her work was fine, that I was just trying to pace myself better. There was a pause on the line, long enough for me to hear her breathing, and then she said something that landed heavier than she probably intended. She said, "You know, your sister would never abandon me like this." Abandon. The word echoed in my head long after the call ended. I'd been there every day for years, but the moment I stepped back an inch, I was framed as someone walking away. I started to see the pattern then, clearer than ever before. My presence had been invisible when it was constant, only my absence had weight. Lila called later that afternoon. Her tone was sharper than my mother's, less careful. She asked why Mom was upset, why things weren't getting done, why she was suddenly being asked to help more. I told her, gently at first, that I couldn't carry everything alone anymore. She laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, and said, "You've always been dramatic." Then she reminded me that Mom needed stability, that change was bad for her anxiety. I almost asked if my anxiety counted, but I already knew the answer. What I hadn't expected was how quickly the family narrative shifted. Where I had once been praised as dependable, I was now labeled distant. Where I had been strong, I was now cold. My mother began keeping a mental list of my failures, bringing them up casually at dinner in front of Lila. The trash hadn't been taken out on time, the mail was piling up, dinner was late. Each comment was small, but together they formed a picture of neglect that didn't match reality, but felt convincing enough when repeated. I tried to talk to her about the will once, thinking maybe there had been a misunderstanding. I told her I didn't expect to be rewarded, but that it hurt to feel erased after everything I'd done. She looked at me with a mix of irritation and disbelief, as if I'd just broken an unspoken rule. She said money shouldn't matter to me, that she'd raised me better than that. She said Lila needed the house because she'd never been good with money, because life was harder for her. And then she said, "You chose to help. No one forced you." That sentence did something to me. It peeled back years of justification and left the truth exposed. I had chosen to help, yes, but I had chosen it under the assumption that love ran both ways, that being needed didn't mean being disposable. Hearing my sacrifices reframed as optional made me realize how little they'd been valued. So I stopped explaining. I stopped defending myself. I started planning. It wasn't dramatic at first. I quietly increased my hours at work. I reconnected with an old friend over coffee. I began saving again, setting aside money I'd once spent on household expenses. Each small act of independence felt both thrilling and terrifying, like stepping onto ice that might crack. The more I pulled away, the more tension filled the house. Conversations became transactional. My mother spoke to me only when she needed something. Lila started dropping by unannounced, surveying the place like an inspector, pointing out what wasn't done. One evening, after Lila left in a huff because dinner wasn't ready, my mother sat across from me at the kitchen table. She folded her hands and told me she was disappointed. She said she didn't recognize me anymore. I looked at her, really looked, and realized she was right. I didn't recognize myself either. Not the version she was describing, at least. That version had no needs, no limits, no future outside of service. I told her I was planning to move out within the year. The silence that followed was thick, almost physical. She asked how I could even think about leaving her alone. I reminded her that Lila lived 20 minutes away. She said that wasn't the same. I asked why. She didn't answer. Word spread quickly through extended family. An aunt called to say my mother was heartbroken, that she didn't understand what she'd done to deserve this. A cousin messaged me to say family comes first. No one asked my side. No one wondered how 10 years of caregiving might wear a person down. I was the villain in a story they found easier to tell than the truth. The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon. I had just returned from a long shift when I found my sister and mother sitting together in the living room, papers spread out on the coffee table. Lila was talking animatedly about renovations she wanted to do once the house was hers. She talked about knocking down walls, changing the kitchen, turning my old bedroom into an office. She spoke as if I wasn't there, as if the house had already shed me. My mother nodded along, smiling faintly, occasionally glancing at me with something like defiance. Something inside me snapped, quietly but completely. I didn't yell, I didn't interrupt. I went to my room and closed the door. I sat on the bed and felt the weight of it all press down on my chest. Not just the inheritance, but the years of being taken for granted, the way my usefulness had been mistaken for obligation. I realized then that staying any longer would hollow me out entirely. 2 weeks later, I signed a lease on a small apartment across town. I didn't tell my mother right away. I waited until everything was arranged, until I couldn't be talked out of it. When I finally did, she cried. She said I was choosing strangers over family. She said she'd never forgive herself for raising a child who could walk away. I listened, tears running down my face, and told her I wasn't walking away. I was stepping towards something. She didn't understand the difference. Moving out felt like a betrayal and a liberation. I packed my things slowly, deliberately, leaving behind the parts of myself that had been shaped by that house. On my last night there, I stood in the kitchen and touched the counter where I'd prepared thousands of meals. I felt grief, but also relief, the kind that comes when you finally admit the truth. In the months that followed, the calls became less frequent. When they did come, they were often laced with guilt. My mother struggled more without me, though she'd never admit it directly. Lila complained about the burden, about how hard it was to manage everything. I offered suggestions. I refused to move back. The dynamic shifted again, this time out of necessity. The final conversation about the will happened unexpectedly during a quiet lunch with my mother at a cafe. She looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow. She told me she was tired, that Lila was overwhelmed, that maybe they'd made mistakes. She didn't apologize, she didn't offer to change anything, but she asked if I could help more again. I looked at her and felt compassion, real compassion, but it didn't erase the boundary I'd built. I told her I loved her, that I would help in ways that cost me my life. She nodded, though I don't think she fully understood. Some lessons come too late to be useful. Now, years later, I can see the story more clearly. I didn't stop helping because of the money. I stopped because I finally saw how little my well-being mattered in a system that relied on my silence. Walking away didn't make me heartless. It taught me the difference between love and obligation. If there's a moral here, it's this. Being the strong one doesn't mean you're unbreakable, and being needed doesn't mean you're valued. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop pouring from an empty cup and trust that the world won't end if you choose yourself. After I moved out, silence became the loudest thing in my life. Not the peaceful kind people talk about when they escape something hard, but the uneasy quiet that follows a storm when you're not sure what's been damaged beyond repair. For years, my days had been structured around other people's needs. Wake up early, check medications, make breakfast, coordinate appointments, clean, repeat. Suddenly, my mornings were my own, and I didn't know what to do with them. I'd sit at my small kitchen table, coffee cooling in my hands, feeling both free and strangely untethered. The guilt didn't disappear just because I changed addresses. If anything, it got louder at first. Every unanswered call felt like a test I was failing. Every time my phone buzzed with my mother's name, my stomach tightened. I'd brace myself before answering, already rehearsing defenses I hoped I wouldn't need. Sometimes she just wanted to talk. Other times she wanted to remind me, subtly or not, of everything I was no longer doing. She'd mention how tired she was, how the house felt too big, how Lila was struggling. She never said, "I need you back," but the implication hung in the air. Lila's calls were different. They were sharper, more urgent, usually starting with a complaint. The pharmacy messed up. The insurance company was impossible. Mom was being difficult. Each problem came with an unspoken expectation that I'd step in and fix it. When I offered advice instead of action, she grew frustrated. She accused me of abandoning them, of changing, of becoming selfish since I got my own place. I listened longer than I should have, absorbing words that still knew how to wound me. Old habits die hard. What surprised me most was how quickly my absence revealed cracks that had always been there. Without me buffering the tension, my mother and sister clashed more openly. Lila resented the responsibility she'd inherited. My mother resented that Lila wasn't me. They called me to vent about each other, pulling me back into the middle where I'd always lived. At first, I let them. It felt familiar, almost comforting to be needed again. But after one call where my mother cried for an hour while I murmured reassurances, I hung up and realized I felt exactly like I used to, drained, invisible. That night, I set a rule for myself. I would no longer be the emotional dumping ground. I told them both, gently but firmly, that I couldn't mediate their conflicts, that if they needed help, we could talk about practical solutions, but I wouldn't absorb their anger or sadness anymore. The backlash was immediate. Lila accused me of acting superior. My mother said I was being cold. I held my ground anyway, hands shaking, heart pounding, reminding myself that boundaries feel cruel to people who benefit from you having none. As months passed, my life slowly expanded. I decorated my apartment with colors I liked instead of neutral tones chosen to avoid complaints. I started going for evening walks just because I could. I accepted invitations without checking anyone else's schedule first. These were small freedoms, but they felt enormous to someone who'd lived on standby for so long. With each one, the version of me that existed only in service began to loosen its grip. Still, the inheritance issue lingered like an unresolved chord. It wasn't about wanting the house anymore. I didn't. It was about what the decision represented, the final confirmation that my role in the family had always been functional, not foundational. One afternoon, sorting through old boxes I'd brought from my parents' house, I found cards my mother had written over the years. Birthday notes thanking me for being such a help, Christmas messages praising my reliability. Not once did she write that she was proud of me for who I was, only for what I did. Around that time, my mother had a fall, nothing catastrophic, but enough to land her in the hospital overnight. Lila called me in a panic, voice trembling, asking me to come immediately. For a moment, instinct took over. I grabbed my keys, heart racing, ready to slip back into the role that felt like muscle memory. Then I stopped. I asked what the doctors said. I asked if she was stable. When Lila said yes, just shaken, I told her I'd come the next day. There was a long pause, followed by anger. She said she couldn't believe I was doing this now. I said quietly that now was exactly when I needed to do it differently. When I arrived at the hospital the next morning, my mother looked relieved to see me, but also guarded. We talked about the fall, the tests, the plan for recovery. It was the first conversation we'd had in a long time that felt almost normal. As I was about to leave, she reached for my hand and said she hadn't realized how much I'd been doing until I wasn't there to do it anymore. The words were simple, unadorned, but they landed deep. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't a reversal of the will, but it was an acknowledgement, and for the first time it felt real. That moment didn't fix everything. Lila still struggled, my mother still defaulted to old expectations sometimes, but something shifted. They began to solve problems without immediately calling me. They hired part-time help. Lila adjusted her schedule. The world didn't collapse the way they'd always implied it would if I stepped back. That realization was both validating and painful. Validating because it proved I hadn't been indispensable. Painful because it meant I never had to give as much as I did to keep things afloat. A year later, my mother asked to revisit the estate plans. She said she'd been thinking a lot, that the fall had scared her, that she wanted things to be fair. I listened carefully, heart guarded. She said she was considering leaving me a portion of the savings, maybe adjusting the house arrangement. I thanked her for telling me, but I surprised us both by saying the decision was hers to make and that I'd be okay either way. And I meant it. Somewhere along the way, my need for validation through inheritance had faded. I no longer needed proof of my worth from people who struggled to see it. When she passed 2 years later, peacefully, the will had been updated, but not drastically. Lila still received the house, I received a modest sum, and a letter. In it, my mother wrote that she hadn't always understood me, that she'd relied on my strength without asking what it cost me. She said she hoped I'd forgive her. I cried when I read it, not because it erased the past, but because it finally named it. Lila and I are not close now, but we are civil. There's a distance between us that feels necessary. Sometimes I think she resents me for stepping away, for forcing her to step up. Other times I think she envies the life I built once I stopped carrying everyone else's. I don't try to resolve that for her. Some lessons aren't meant to be shared. What I know now is this: love that depends on your exhaustion isn't love, it's convenience. Families don't always mean harm, but they can still do it, especially when roles harden into expectations. Walking away didn't make me less compassionate, it taught me how to direct compassion toward myself. If you're listening to this and you're the strong one, the reliable one, the one who's always there, I hope you hear this part clearly. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to say no. And you are allowed to stop helping when helping costs you your sense of self. That isn't cruelty, it's survival. After my mother passed, the world didn't slow down the way I expected it to. There was no dramatic pause, no moment where everything stopped to acknowledge the weight of what had ended. Life kept moving. Bills still arrived, traffic lights still changed, and somehow I was expected to keep moving with it. Grief is strange like that. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums quietly in the background, showing up in unexpected places. In grocery aisles, in the smell of laundry detergent, in the instinct to reach for my phone to call her before remembering there was no one to answer. The letter she left me stayed folded in my wallet for months. I didn't reread it often, but I liked knowing it was there. Proof that, at least at the end, she'd seen me. Not perfectly, not fully, but enough to put it into words. I held on to that more than the money, which I left untouched in my account for a long time, unsure what to do with it. It felt symbolic somehow, like spending it too quickly would cheapen the years that led up to it. Leela handled the house after the funeral. She moved in fully, just like she'd always planned, and started making changes almost immediately. She replaced furniture, repainted walls, erased signs of the life that had existed before. When she told me about it, her voice carried a strange mix of pride and defensiveness, like she expected me to object. I didn't. That house had stopped being home to me long before I left it physically. Letting her remake it felt like closing a door that had already been ajar for years. Our relationship after that settled into something distant but stable. We exchanged polite messages on birthdays and holidays. Occasionally, she'd ask my opinion on practical matters, but she no longer expected me to step in and fix everything. I could tell she was tired. Carrying responsibility hadn't transformed her the way it had me. It frustrated her, wore her down, and sometimes I saw flashes of resentment in her eyes when we spoke. I wondered if she ever realized how much of that burden I'd carried alone. I wondered if she ever thought about why I stopped. One afternoon, not long after the estate was settled, I ran into an old neighbor from my parents' street. She hugged me tightly and said, "Your mother relied on you so much. I don't know how she managed after you left." Her words were meant as comfort, but they stirred something complicated inside me. I smiled and said she managed, because she did. Not easily, not without struggle, but she did. And hearing someone acknowledge that reliance without accusing me of abandoning it felt unexpectedly healing. That was when I realized something important. My story had been told for years through other people's lenses: the dutiful daughter, the dependable one, the selfish one who left. Rarely had I told it myself, even in my own head. I'd accepted labels without question, adjusting my behavior to fit whatever version made others most comfortable. Stepping away hadn't just changed my circumstances, it had forced me to reclaim my narrative. I started therapy around that time, not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand how I'd ended up there in the first place. Session by session, I unpacked the quiet agreements I'd made as a child. Be good, be helpful, don't need too much, don't make things harder. My therapist helped me see how those rules had protected me once, but trapped me later. How my sense of worth had become entangled with being indispensable. Untangling that took time. It still does. As I grew more comfortable with my boundaries, I noticed how often people tested them. Not just family, but coworkers, friends, even strangers. There were subtle pushes, small expectations, moments where saying yes would have been easier than holding my ground. Each time I chose myself, the guilt softened a little more. I learned that discomfort doesn't always mean you're doing something wrong. Sometimes it means you're doing something new. There were moments of loneliness too. I won't pretend otherwise. When you step out of a role that defined you, there's a gap where that identity used to be. I had to figure out who I was without constant responsibility, without crisis to manage. Some evenings felt emptier than I expected, but even that emptiness felt honest. It was space I could fill intentionally instead of space filled for me by obligation. About a year after my mother's death, Leela called me unexpectedly. Her voice was quieter than usual. She told me she was exhausted, that she hadn't realized how consuming it would be to manage the house, the finances, everything. She said, "I don't know how you did it for so long." The words hung between us, heavy with things unsaid. I told her I didn't know either, and for the first time there was no accusation in her silence, just understanding, arriving late, but arriving nonetheless. We didn't suddenly become close after that. There were no tearful apologies or dramatic reconciliations, but something softened. She stopped framing my departure as betrayal. I stopped expecting her to acknowledge the past perfectly. We met each other where we were, not where we wished we'd been. Sometimes that's the most realistic ending you get. Looking back now, I can see how pivotal that moment with the will really was, not because of what I lost financially, but because it stripped away the illusion that sacrifice guarantees security. It forced me to confront the uncomfortable truth that being good doesn't always protect you from being overlooked. That realization hurt, but it also freed me. Once I stopped tying my value to how much I gave, I became lighter, more honest, more whole. I still help people. That part of me didn't disappear, but I help differently now, with limits, with awareness, with the understanding that generosity should flow both ways, or at least not drain you dry. I've learned to ask myself one simple question before saying yes. If no one ever thanked me for this, would I still want to do it? If the answer is no, I pause. That pause has changed my life. If you're listening and you recognize yourself in this story, I want you to know something important. You don't have to wait for a betrayal this big to reevaluate your role. You don't have to be written out of a will or pushed to exhaustion to justify choosing yourself. Your needs don't have to be catastrophic to be valid. Quiet suffering counts too. I loved my parents. I still do. Loving them didn't mean sacrificing myself endlessly. It meant learning when to step back, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. That lesson didn't come easily, but it stayed with me. And in the end, it gave me something I'd never had before, a life that felt like it belonged to me. With time, the sharp edges of everything began to dull. Not disappear, but soften, like sea glass worn smooth by years of tide and motion. I started to notice how far I'd come in small, ordinary ways. The way my shoulders no longer tensed when my phone rang. The way I could make plans without mentally calculating who might need me that day. The way silence in my apartment felt calm instead of accusatory. These weren't milestones anyone else could see, but they were proof of healing all the same. I changed jobs not long after settling into this new version of my life. The old one had been chosen for convenience, for proximity to my parents' house, for flexibility that allowed me to leave at a moment's notice. The new one challenged me. It asked more of my mind and less of my availability. On my first day, when my supervisor asked about my long-term goals, I hesitated. For so long, I'd avoided thinking too far ahead, afraid of tempting fate, afraid of planning a future that might need to be surrendered. Saying my goals out loud felt like a declaration I wasn't used to making, but once I did, something steadied inside me. There were moments, though, when the old conditioning resurfaced. Holidays were especially hard. I'd feel the pull to recreate traditions I once carried on my back, to cook for too many people, to overextend. Each year, I scaled it back a little more, choosing presence over performance. Some relatives noticed, a few commented. I learned to let their opinions pass through me without settling. You don't owe anyone a version of yourself that costs you peace. Leela and I found a rhythm that worked, even if it wasn't close. Occasionally, she'd mention the house repairs, the endless maintenance, the weight of it all. I listened without rushing to solve. Sometimes she asked how I managed caregiving for so long. I told her the truth. I managed because I didn't think I had a choice. That answer lingered between us, heavy but honest. I think it helped her understand that my leaving wasn't cruelty, it was survival. One evening, after a particularly long conversation, she said something that surprised me. She said she thought our parents trusted me more because I never complained, because I never asked for anything, because I made it look easy. Hearing that reframed so much. My silence hadn't just hidden my pain, it had convinced everyone else there was no pain at all. That realization stung, but it also gave me clarity. I'd trained people how to treat me by never showing them my limits. That understanding rippled outward into other areas of my life. I began practicing saying what I needed before resentment had time to grow. I spoke up when I was overwhelmed. I asked for help. Each time, the world didn't fall apart. In fact, people responded better than I expected. Some relationships deepened, others faded. Both outcomes felt honest. I sometimes think about who I might have been if things had been different, if the inheritance had been divided equally, if my parents had acknowledged my sacrifices sooner, if I'd been encouraged to build a life separate from theirs. But I don't linger there long. Regret can become another form of captivity if you let it. Instead, I focus on who I am now, someone who knows her worth without needing it confirmed through obligation. There's a particular memory that stays with me. It happened a few years after everything settled. I was sitting on my balcony at dusk, watching the sky shift colors when it hit me that no one needed anything from me in that moment. No calls to return, no tasks waiting, just quiet. Instead of panic, I felt gratitude. That quiet wasn't emptiness, it was choice, and it felt earned. I won't pretend that stopping my help didn't come with consequences. It did. It strained relationships. It changed how some people saw me. It forced me to sit with discomfort I'd spent a lifetime avoiding. But it also saved me from becoming a ghost in my own life. Sometimes the cost of staying is higher than the cost of leaving, even when leaving breaks your heart a little. If there's one thing I wish I could go back and tell my younger self, it's this. Love doesn't require you to disappear. Caregiving doesn't mean self-erasure. And being the strong one doesn't obligate you to carry everyone forever. Strength can also look like stepping back and trusting others to step up, even if they stumble. Today, when I help, it's a choice I make freely, not a role I'm trapped in. I show up with my whole self, not the exhausted fragments I used to offer. And when I feel my limits approaching, I honor them. That doesn't make me less loving, it makes my love sustainable. I share this story not because I have all the answers, but because I know how isolating it feels to be the one who holds everything together. If you're listening and you're tired in a way sleep won't fix, I hope you pause and ask yourself a hard question. What would happen if you stopped? Not forever, just long enough to breathe, long enough to see who you are without the weight. You might be surprised by what remains. As the years stretched on, I began to notice how the story I'd lived was still unfolding in quiet ways, long after the loud chapters had ended. Healing isn't a straight line. It circles back on itself, revisiting old wounds from new angles, asking you to look again at what you thought you'd already understood. There were days when I felt solid and grounded, certain I'd done the right thing. And then there were days when doubt crept in, whispering questions I couldn't fully silence. Had I been too harsh? Could I have stayed a little longer? Should I have tried harder to make them understand? Those thoughts usually came late at night when the world was still and my defenses were down. I'd replay moments from the past, searching for a version of events where everyone was satisfied, where no one felt abandoned or resentful. But that version never held together for long. It required me to be smaller than I was, quieter than I'd learned to be. It required me to disappear again. And every time I imagined that, my chest tightened in a way that told me the truth my mind sometimes resisted. I couldn't go back without losing myself. I started volunteering once a week at a local community center, something entirely separate from family obligation. The difference surprised me. I gave my time and energy, but there was no unspoken contract attached, no expectation that I'd sacrifice my future. When I left, I left. When I showed up, it was because I wanted to. That distinction healed something subtle but deep. It reminded me that helping could still be joyful, still meaningful, when it wasn't tied to guilt or fear. One afternoon, while helping an elderly woman fill out paperwork, she looked up at me and said, "You're very patient. You must take care of everyone." The comment was casual, meant as praise, but it stopped me cold. I smiled and said I used to. That sentence felt like closing a chapter, acknowledging out loud that the version of me who existed only to care for others was part of my past, not my present. Lila's life continued in ways I observed from a distance. She struggled financially at times, especially when unexpected repairs came up. The house demanded more than she'd anticipated. Once, she hinted that maybe selling it would be easier. I didn't offer advice. I didn't remind her of how fiercely she'd wanted it. I let her sit with the reality of the inheritance she'd received, unfiltered by my labor. That wasn't punishment, it was simply reality allowed to unfold. Our conversations became more honest as a result. She admitted she'd assumed things would just work out the way they always had before. I told her gently that things had worked out because I'd made them work. There was no accusation in my voice, just fact. She nodded slowly, eyes downcast, and for the first time I saw something like regret cross her face. Not dramatic remorse, but quiet recognition. Sometimes that's all you get. Extended family eventually stopped calling to comment on my choices. Time does that. It dulls outrage, shifts attention elsewhere. New dramas took center stage. New villains were appointed. I faded back into neutrality, which suited me just fine. I learned that not being talked about is its own kind of freedom. There was one conversation, though, that stayed with me more than the rest. It happened with my aunt, my mother's sister, years after everything had settled. We met for lunch, and after some small talk, she said she'd always wondered how I managed everything for so long. She said my mother had relied on me more than she ever admitted. Then she paused and said, "I don't think she knew how to give you what you needed, even though she loved you." Hearing that didn't absolve the past, but it softened it. It allowed room for complexity, for the truth that harm isn't always born from malice. Sometimes it comes from limitation. That understanding helped me let go of the last threads of anger I'd been carrying, not because the past was suddenly okay, but because I no longer needed to carry it forward. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't about excusing what happened. It's about deciding what you no longer want to drag with you into the future. I began dating again around that time, cautiously at first. I noticed patterns I hadn't before, the urge to overgive, to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to make myself indispensable. Recognizing those impulses gave me the power to interrupt them. I practiced letting people meet me halfway. Some relationships didn't survive that shift. Others grew stronger. I learned that the right people don't need you to exhaust yourself to earn a place in their lives. Every now and then I dream about my parents' house. In the dreams, it was always in transition, boxes half-packed, walls bare, doors open. I took that as my mind's way of processing a long goodbye, not just to them, but to the version of myself who lived there, quietly setting herself aside. The moral of my story isn't that family doesn't matter, it's that you matter too. Too often we frame sacrifice as the highest form of love, especially for those who are capable and dependable. But sacrifice without choice becomes resentment, and resentment erodes even the strongest bonds. Love that demands your silence isn't love that can sustain you. If you're listening and you're standing at the edge of a decision like the one I faced, I want you to know this. You don't have to justify your exhaustion. You don't need permission to rest. And you don't have to wait for everything to fall apart before you decide to change. Sometimes the bravest act is stepping back while things are still standing. I didn't stop helping because I stopped caring. I stopped because I cared enough about myself to recognize that I was fading, and choosing not to fade was the first real gift I ever gave myself. By the time I reached my 40s, I'd stopped measuring my life by crisis points. There was a calmness to my days that once would have felt unfamiliar, even unsettling. I woke up without dread. I planned weeks ahead without factoring in emergencies that might pull me back into old patterns. Stability, I learned, can feel boring when you spent years surviving chaos. But boredom, I came to understand, is often just peace without adrenaline. Still, peace doesn't erase memory, it reframes it. Every so often, something small would trigger a rush of the past, a certain brand of soup at the grocery store, the sound of an ambulance passing too close, a calendar reminder for a date that used to be filled with appointments. When those moments came, I no longer tried to push them away. I let them pass through me, acknowledged the history they carried, and reminded myself that I was no longer living there. Lila and I met occasionally for coffee now, usually in neutral spaces where old dynamics had less room to resurface. Our conversations stayed mostly on the surface, but they were kinder than before. She spoke more openly about her stress, her regrets, her sense that she'd been unprepared for adulthood in ways she hadn't fully understood. Once she admitted she envied my independence. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. I told her independence had been forged in necessity, not preference, that it came with a cost she'd never seen. She nodded and said quietly, "I think Mom assumed you'd always be okay." Hearing my own long-held suspicion voiced out loud felt strange, validating, painful, relieving. Sometimes the hardest part of being the strong one is that people stop checking if you're still standing. One afternoon, while cleaning out old emails, I found messages from years earlier, notes from doctors, reminders of appointments, long threads of logistics that had once consumed my days. Reading them felt like looking into someone else's life. I could see how competent I'd been, how much I'd managed, and also how little space there'd been for me as a person. It was sobering to realize how normalized that it felt at the time. I started mentoring a younger colleague at work around then, someone bright and eager who reminded me of myself at her age. She worked late, said yes to everything, apologized for needing time off. One day, she thanked me for being such a good support. The words made me pause. I told her something I wish someone had told me years ago, that being helpful doesn't mean being endlessly available, that her career shouldn't consume her identity. She listened, wide-eyed, and I hoped the seed would take root. There were moments when I wondered what my parents would think of the life I built. Would they be proud? Confused? Would they see the strength in choosing myself, or would they still view it as abandonment? I stopped chasing those answers. They belonged to a relationship that had already ended. What mattered was that I was proud of myself, that I could look at my life and recognize it as my own. On anniversaries of my mother's death, I allowed myself to grieve without guilt. Grief doesn't mean regret, it means love existed. I'd visit a park she liked, sit quietly and let memories come and go. Some were tender, some were hard. All were part of the same story. Holding that complexity without needing to resolve it felt like growth. One of the most unexpected changes came in how I spoke about myself. I stopped leading with what I did for others. I talked about my interests, my plans, my opinions. It sounds small, but it was revolutionary for someone who'd spent decades being defined by service. People responded differently. Some leaned in, others drifted away. Both reactions taught me something valuable about compatibility. I began to see how often society praises self-sacrifice, especially in women, without acknowledging its cost. How easily devotion becomes expectation, how quietly resentment builds when care is unreciprocated. My story wasn't unique. Once I started sharing pieces of it, others opened up about similar experiences, the invisible labor, the unequal burdens, the moment they realized love had limits. There was comfort in that shared understanding. Lila and I had one conversation that felt like a turning point. We were sitting across from each other, coffee cooling between us, when she said she wished things had been different, that she wished she'd helped more. The words weren't dramatic, but they were sincere. I told her I wished that too. We sat in that mutual regret without trying to fix it. Some things don't need solutions, they need acknowledgement. As I moved further from the years that defined me by obligation, I grew more comfortable with uncertainty. I no longer needed guarantees that my choices were right. I trusted myself enough to adapt if they weren't. That trust was hard-earned, and I guarded it carefully. Looking back, the moment I stopped helping wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of one where I was finally present, where my needs weren't an afterthought, where love wasn't measured by how much I could endure. If there's one lasting lesson I carry, it's this: you can honor your past without living in it. You can love people who couldn't love you the way you needed, and you can step into a future that looks nothing like what you were taught to expect. That choice doesn't erase the pain, but it does give it meaning. There came a point when the story stopped feeling raw and started feeling settled, like a scar you no longer flinch at when it's touched. I didn't notice the change all at once. It revealed itself in moments so ordinary they almost slipped past me. The first time I was asked to take on extra responsibility at work, and I said no without rehearsing an explanation. The first time I missed a family gathering and didn't spend the entire day apologizing in my head. The first time I realized weeks had gone by without thinking about the will at all. Letting go doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just quietly moves in and rearranges the furniture. I began to notice how differently I moved through the world. I listened more closely to my own reactions. When something felt heavy, I paid attention instead of pushing through. When something felt right, I trusted it without needing external approval. That internal compass had always been there, buried under layers of duty and expectation. Clearing those layers away felt like learning to hear my own voice again. Lila and I continued our careful, respectful distance, but there was less tension in it now. Once she asked if I ever regretted leaving. The question wasn't loaded the way it would have been years earlier. It sounded genuinely curious. I took my time answering. I told her I regretted how painful it was, how much it hurt everyone involved, but I didn't regret the decision itself. Saying that out loud felt like closing a loop that had been open for far too long. She nodded and said she understood, even if she couldn't fully relate. That was enough. Understanding doesn't always mean agreement. Sometimes it just means recognizing another person's truth as real, even when it challenges your own. I thought a lot about fairness as I got older, how we often confuse equality with equity, how my parents believed they were doing the right thing by protecting the child they saw as weaker, without realizing the cost of placing all responsibility on the one they saw as strong. Their intentions weren't cruel, but the impact was. That distinction mattered to me. It allowed me to hold compassion without minimizing the harm. There was a season when I revisited old photos, not out of longing, but curiosity. I studied my younger self in those pictures, the forced smiles, the tired eyes, the way my body leaned inward as if bracing. I wanted to reach through time and tell her she wasn't imagining things, that it really was too much, that it wasn't selfish to want more than survival. I couldn't change her path, but I could honor it by choosing differently now. The inheritance, once such a looming symbol, became just another fact of my history. The money I received eventually found its way into things that mattered to me: education, travel, a small emergency fund that made me feel safe in a way I never had before. Each use of it felt intentional, grounded in the life I was building rather than the one I'd left behind. It no longer felt like a consolation prize. It felt like a tool. One afternoon, while walking through a quiet neighborhood, I passed a woman helping her elderly parent into a car. I recognized the posture immediately, the careful attentiveness, the way her body angled protectively. I felt a surge of empathy so strong it surprised me. Not pity, recognition. I hoped, silently, that she had help, that she had someone reminding her she mattered too, that she wouldn't wait until exhaustion forced her to stop. That's the thing about stories like mine. You start seeing them everywhere once you know what to look for. In conversations overheard at coffee shops, in friends who cancel plans one too many times, in coworkers who never take vacation. The strong ones are everywhere, quietly holding things together, rarely asked how they're doing. When I can, I ask, and when they answer honestly, I listen. I stopped thinking of my decision as stopping help and started thinking of it as redefining it. I didn't abandon my family. I changed the terms of engagement. I refused to continue a pattern that required my erasure. That distinction matters, especially to people who've been taught love must hurt to be real. There were still moments of sadness, especially around milestones my parents never saw. Career achievements, personal accomplishments, days when I wished I could call my mother and hear her voice, even knowing it would have come with expectations. Grief doesn't disappear just because you made the right choice. It simply becomes part of the landscape, something you navigate rather than something that blocks your way. One evening, sitting alone with a glass of wine, I realized something that startled me with its simplicity. I was content. Not euphoric, not triumphant, just settled. My life wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and honesty, I'd learned, was far more sustainable than sacrifice disguised as love. I thought about how easily things could have gone differently, how close I'd come to staying for fear, how often I'd silenced myself to keep the peace. Fear is a powerful motivator, especially when it wears the mask of loyalty. But loyalty that demands your silence is no loyalty at all. It's control, softened by familiarity. If you're listening and you're still in the thick of it, still carrying more than your share, I want you to know this. You don't have to burn everything down to make a change. Sometimes the bravest shifts are quiet ones. A boundary, a pause, a decision not to answer every call. Those small acts can reshape your life in ways you can't yet imagine. I didn't stop helping because I stopped loving. I stopped because I finally understood love without balance becomes something else entirely. And choosing balance didn't make me heartless, it made me whole. By the time the story had settled into something I could carry without strain, I realized I'd stopped explaining myself to people who were never really listening. That was one of the quiet victories I hadn't expected. For years, I'd believed that if I could just find the right words, the right tone, the right moment, everyone would finally understand why I did what I did. But understanding, I learned, isn't something you can force. It has to be chosen. And not everyone is willing to choose it, especially when your clarity disrupts their comfort. I began to notice how often people ask questions not to hear the answer, but to confirm the story they already believe. When I stopped feeding those stories, when I stopped shrinking my truth to fit them, some people drifted away. Others stayed, curious and open. That sorting wasn't something I planned, but it turned out to be necessary. There was a season when I felt almost protective of my peace. I guarded my time carefully, aware of how easily it could be eroded by old habits. I said no more often than yes. I left gatherings early if my energy dipped. I rested without apologizing. At first, these choices felt selfish in the way I'd been taught to fear, but over time, they felt responsible, sustainable, like tending to something fragile that had been neglected for too long. I also became more honest with myself about grief, not just grief for my parents, but grief for the life I might have had if I'd learned these lessons sooner. There were years I'd never get back, opportunities I'd passed up without realizing what I was giving away. A younger version of me who deserved rest and reassurance and didn't receive nearly enough of either. Allowing myself to mourn that loss without judgment felt like another layer of healing. Sometimes, late at night, I'd imagine sitting across from my parents as they were before illness and age changed them. I'd imagine telling them how tired I'd been, how alone I'd felt, even while surrounded by responsibility. In those imagined conversations, they listened. They didn't defend themselves. They didn't explain. They just heard me. I don't know if that's how it would have gone in real life, but imagining it helped me release the need for it to ever happen. Lila's life continued to evolve too. She eventually decided to sell the house. When she told me, there was a tremor in her voice I hadn't heard before. Letting go of it felt bigger than she'd expected. That house wasn't just walls and memories, it was security, identity, proof that she'd been chosen. I listened quietly, understanding more than I said. When she asked if I wanted anything from it before it sold, I told her no. What I'd needed from that place, I'd already reclaimed. After the sale, she seemed lighter in some ways, unmoored in others. Responsibility had aged her, I saw that now. Not in a cruel way, but in a human one. She spoke more thoughtfully, complained less casually. Once, she admitted she hadn't realized how much I'd absorbed until she was forced to absorb it herself. That admission didn't feel like vindication, it felt like closure. I didn't correct her. I didn't add details. I let the moment be what it was. Recognition, even delayed, still matters. I found myself drawn to quieter joys, morning light through open windows, long walks without destination, books read slowly instead of in stolen minutes. These weren't things I'd been denied outright before, but they'd always been interrupted, secondary to someone else's needs. Experiencing them fully felt like inhabiting my own life for the first time. At work, I was trusted in a different way now, not because I never said no, but because when I said yes, it was intentional. I noticed how people respected my time more when I respected it myself. That lesson echoed across every area of my life. Boundaries didn't push people away, they clarified where I ended and others began. There were still moments when old instincts flared. When someone was struggling, my first impulse was to take over, to fix, to carry. I learned to pause in those moments and ask myself what was actually being asked of me. Support doesn't always mean sacrifice. Sometimes it means presence. Sometimes it means stepping back and trusting others to find their footing. I thought often about the phrase stopped helping, the way it sounds so final, so harsh. The truth was more nuanced. I hadn't stopped helping. I'd stopped being the default solution. I'd stopped allowing my identity to be reduced to usefulness. That shift changed everything. If my parents had divided things differently, if they'd recognized my contribution sooner, would I have stayed? Maybe, but I don't dwell on that hypothetical anymore. It assumes that fairness would have fixed something that ran deeper than money. The imbalance wasn't just financial, it was emotional, structural, cultural. Addressing it required more than a revised will. It required a reckoning we never fully had. And yet, I don't feel bitter when I think about them now. I feel a quiet sadness mixed with understanding. They did the best they could with what they knew, and it still wasn't enough. Both things can be true at once. Holding that complexity feels like maturity, even when it aches. If there's a message I wish people would take from my story, it's this. You don't have to be the villain in someone else's story to be the hero in your own. Sometimes choosing yourself means accepting that others won't like the version of you who has limits. That discomfort doesn't mean you're wrong, it means the dynamic has changed. I didn't lose my family when I stopped helping. I lost an illusion. The illusion that love could only exist if I carried the heaviest load. The illusion that my needs were optional. Letting go of that illusion hurt, but it also freed me. Now, when I think about the future, I don't imagine myself bracing for impact. I imagine growth, curiosity, room to breathe, and that, more than anything, feels like the inheritance I was always meant to claim. As I moved deeper into the life I'd chosen, I began to understand something that once felt abstract. Closure isn't a single moment. It's a series of small decisions you make every day to live differently than you once did. It's choosing not to reopen old wounds just to check if they still hurt. It's allowing the past to inform you without letting it define you. I didn't wake up one morning feeling finished with my story. I simply woke up feeling less haunted by it. There were still anniversaries that stirred something in me, dates tied to hospital stays, difficult conversations, turning points I'd never forget. Instead of bracing against those days, I started acknowledging them gently. I'd take a long walk, light a candle, write a few lines in a journal I kept just for myself. Ritual, I learned, doesn't have to be religious or dramatic. Sometimes it's just a way of saying, "This mattered." The more distance I had from the years of caregiving, the clearer my perspective became. I could see how my parents' choices were shaped by fear as much as love. Fear of losing my sister, fear of instability, fear of facing their own limitations. None of that excused the imbalance, but it explained it in a way that no longer felt personal. Understanding that freed me from carrying blame that was never meant to be mine. I also noticed how often people conflated forgiveness with reconciliation. They'd ask if Lila and I were close again, if everything was back to normal. I learned to answer honestly. There was no going back. Normal had never worked. What we had instead was something quieter, built on realism rather than expectation. Forgiveness didn't require me to return to a role that hurt me. It required me to stop letting resentment live rent-free in my heart. As the years went on, I became more intentional about the relationships I cultivated. I chose people who respected my time, who didn't take my care for granted, who listened when I spoke. I learned to recognize red flags earlier, the subtle entitlement, the imbalance of effort, the way some people confuse closeness with access. Those patterns no longer felt familiar in a comfortable way. They felt like warnings, and I paid attention. There was a moment that crystallized how much I'd changed. A distant relative called one evening, clearly in crisis, asking if she could stay with me for an undefined period. The old me would have said yes without hesitation, rearranged my life, absorbed the fallout. This time, I asked questions. I suggested resources. I offered support that didn't involve sacrificing my home or my peace. When she accused me of being unsupportive, I felt a flicker of guilt, and then it passed. I knew my answer was reasonable. That confidence would have been unimaginable to me once. I thought often about how my parents might have reacted to this version of me. Would they have recognized her strength, or would they have mourned the loss of the daughter who never said no? I stopped needing that answer. Their understanding was no longer a prerequisite for my self-respect. Lila and I shared one final, unexpectedly honest conversation not long after she sold the house. We were walking through a park, leaves crunching underfoot, when she said she finally understood why I'd left. She said carrying everything had shown her how unsustainable it was. She admitted she'd been angry not just at me, but at herself for avoiding responsibility for so long. Her voice broke when she said she wished she'd been braver sooner. I listened, heart full and heavy all at once. I told her I wished we'd both had more support, that neither of us had been set up for balance. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was real, and real mattered more than perfect. In the years since, my life has grown in ways I never anticipated. Not dramatically, not in ways that would impress strangers, but in ways that feel solid. I've built routines that nourish me, friendships that don't drain me, a sense of self that isn't dependent on being needed. I still care deeply. I just don't disappear into that care anymore. The phrase stopped helping still sounds harsh when I hear it out loud, but when I think back to that moment, sitting at the kitchen table, hearing how little space there was for me in my parents' future, I understand why something had to give. Helping had become a one-way street. Continuing would have meant accepting erasure as the price of love. I didn't stop helping because I was angry. I stopped because I finally saw myself clearly. And once you see yourself, truly see yourself, it becomes impossible to keep pretending your needs don't matter. If you're listening and you're afraid of what might happen if you change, I want you to hear this. Change doesn't always destroy what you love. Sometimes it saves what's left of you, and that matters. There's a quiet kind of peace that settles in when you finally stop arguing with your own life. Not the loud, celebratory kind people imagine when they talk about healing, but something softer, steadier, like exhaling after holding your breath for years without realizing you were doing it. That's where I live now. Not untouched by the past, but no longer controlled by it. When I look back at the moment everything changed, the day my mother sat me down and explained the will, I don't feel the same sharp ache I once did. I see it now as a crossroads. A painful one, yes, but also honest. It forced a truth into the open that had been quietly shaping my life all along, that I was valued for my strength but not protected by it, that my reliability had been mistaken for resilience without limits, that love in my family had come with conditions I was never allowed to question. I questioned them anyway. Late, imperfectly, but I did. If I'm honest, the hardest part wasn't stopping the help. It was sitting with who I became after, letting myself exist without a constant purpose tied to someone else's survival, letting joy feel undeserved at first, then slowly normal, letting rest stop feeling like something I had to earn. Those shifts didn't happen overnight. They happened in small, stubborn moments where I chose myself, even when it felt uncomfortable. There were times I missed the clarity of being needed. Being needed gives you a script. It tells you who you are and what you're for. When you step away from that, you have to write your own lines. You have to decide what matters to you when no one else is demanding it. That freedom can feel terrifying before it feels empowering. I filled that freedom carefully, with work that challenged me but didn't consume me, with friendships that allowed silence without guilt, with mornings that belonged only to me. I learned what kind of music I liked when I wasn't catering to someone else's mood, what kind of food I enjoyed when I wasn't cooking for a household, what kind of thoughts surfaced when I wasn't managing someone else's anxiety. And slowly, a person emerged. Not a caretaker, not a buffer, not a safety net, just me. Leela and I still speak occasionally. There's a tenderness there now that didn't exist before, shaped by shared loss and late understanding. We will never be the sisters who tell each other everything. That ship sailed a long time ago. But we are honest. And honesty, I've learned, is a kind of love, too, one that doesn't demand you disappear to maintain it. Sometimes I wonder what my parents would say if they could see me now, if they would recognize the strength they thought I already had, or if they would be startled by the boundaries that strength eventually required. I like to believe my mother, at least, would understand. Her letter suggested as much. It didn't fix the past, but it gave me permission to stop carrying it alone. I've come to accept that not all stories end with fairness, not all sacrifices are rewarded, not all love is balanced, but that doesn't mean your life has to be defined by what you didn't receive. You get to decide what comes next. You get to choose what you carry forward and what you lay down. For me, laying it down meant letting go of the belief that my worth was tied to how much I could endure. It meant understanding that generosity without reciprocity isn't virtue, it's depletion. It meant trusting that the world wouldn't fall apart if I wasn't the one holding it together. And it didn't. That's something I wish more people knew. The fear that keeps you trapped, the fear that everything will collapse if you stop, it's often a story that benefits everyone except you. When you step back, others may struggle, they may be upset, they may have to grow. That doesn't mean you've done something wrong, it means the system was never sustainable to begin with. If you take nothing else from my story, take this. You are allowed to change your role, even if people prefer the old version of you, even if they don't understand, even if they call you selfish. Growth often looks like selfishness to those who relied on your self-neglect. Stopping didn't make me heartless, it made me honest. I still help when I can, I still care deeply, but I no longer measure love by how much it hurts. I no longer confuse obligation with devotion. I no longer believe that being the strong one means being silent. And that, in the end, is the lesson I carry with me. If you are the one everyone leans on, if you are the dependable one, if you are tired in a way rest hasn't fixed yet, please hear me when I say this. You don't have to wait until something is taken from you to realize you deserve more. You don't have to prove your loyalty by sacrificing your future. You don't have to disappear to be loved. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for everyone else is to step back and let the truth breathe. I stopped helping because I finally learned to live.